Hello, everybody. I think there are still one or two people joining, but since time is tight, let's make a start. So good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, to this afternoon's session, which is focusing on fish and more broadly on aquatic products and on the social, environmental and health interactions. I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Tara Garnett. I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford, and I also am the director of an initiative called Table, which is a platform for dialogue and discussion about the future of food and debates surrounding what a good future for the food system might look like. I have to say right at the beginning, and you probably have received a notification right at the start, that the session is being recorded for potential publishing on the symposium website. So I think you've all got your video and your audio automatically shut off anyway in the audience, so that's not an issue. But we'll be finishing the session 10 minutes before the hour for you to get to the next one. I also have to say that as of right now, as far as I'm aware, we are still missing one of our three panelists. So I'm hoping she'll be able to join soon. But if not, then we will try. That is Shakuntula Thilsted. If she is somehow unable to join, then we're all going to have to channel the spirit of her in our discussions and make do. So anyway, that's enough from me. I'm very, very happy to be on the panel with two and hopefully three great speakers. So we have Dr. Benjamin Halpern, who is the director of the National Centre for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis and professor in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. His research leverages environmental data science and synthesis to address a wide range of topics centered on the many ways that human activities are impacting ocean ecosystems and species and the consequences of those impacts on the benefits we receive in turn. I'm going to skip over Shakuntula because she don't think has yet joined, but if one of the moderators could please interrupt to let me know when she has, because I can't see it on the screen, that would be great. So skipping straight to Dr. Jess Sparks, who is our second panelist. She's research assistant professor in the Division of Agriculture, Food, Environment at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. Her research uses applied mixed methods to centre workers' experiences in understanding working conditions, ranging from decent work to forced labour, human trafficking, and modern slavery in marine capture fisheries. So each of them is going to give a short 5 to 10 minute presentation just to kind of kick off the discussion, and then we're going to open out more broadly. There isn't going to be audience Q&A, the reason being that in an event of this kind of brevity, it's perhaps better to just hear what the panelists have to say. That said, my colleague Jackie at Table is going to be copying and pasting all your Q&A, so please do post it in the chat. I'm going to be moving it over to our community platform at Table, and she'll send the link to that as well. And we're really hoping that you will be able to both continue the discussion on the community platform, which is very easy to sign up to, and if our speakers have kindly said that they will be able to look at a few of the questions and answer them as best they can. So that's enough from me. And I'm going to hand over now to Ben. If you could share your screen and give your presentation, that would be great.
Great, thanks, Tara, and thanks everyone for joining. I just want to set the context a little bit of the big picture of sort of how we interact with the ocean and what that means for the impacts we have on ocean ecosystems and the benefits we derive from that as sort of stage setting for how we think about food from the sea and what it means for human benefit and nutrition from the oceans. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the really big picture of all of the ways that human activities affect the oceans, and coastal oceans in particular are sort of the grand aggregator of all things that happen, because everything that happens on land eventually runs off through watersheds to coastal oceans. Everything that happens in the atmosphere, climate change, pollution, things like that, can rain down on the coastal oceans. Everything that happens in the oceans is often, well, eventually makes it to the coast, because biodiversity and human interaction with the oceans is highly concentrated in these coastal areas. So if we really want to think about sustainable management of our planet and our oceans, we really have to pay attention to coastal areas, and in particular, really pay attention to all the many things that happen there. So you're probably aware of a lot of these, or maybe all of them, but we have climate change, which causes coral bleaching from temperature, or ocean acidification that is dissolving shells. We have pollution spills that happen from shipping or from coastal runoff. We have plastic pollution. We have coastal development that destroys coastal habitats, plastic that washes up on their beaches, on and on. There's so many ways that we use, interact with, and sometimes abuse coastal oceans. And so thinking about the role of one sector, for example, fishing or aquaculture, within this larger context, it's really important to pay attention to the potential for these multiple interactions, multiple stressors, to have synergistic or additive effects on coastal health, and therefore what they all mean for the ability for us to continue to derive food from the ocean. About 15 years ago, with a big team, we pulled together all of these data to understand how these cumulative pressures are impacting the oceans. We had about 17 different pressures across fishing, climate change, land-based drivers, and ocean-based drivers. And we found a lot of surprising things at that time. Kind of the three big highlights. One, there's literally no place on the ocean that is untouched by human activities. There's no truly pristine place left. And the second is that over 40% of it is highly impacted, the bright red and dark oranges there. So there's a really widespread heavy impact. And then the third is that it's really both consistent and variable on what is driving this. Consistent in that pretty much anywhere you go, the three big drivers of pressure to the oceans are fishing, climate change, and land-based pollution, other types of pollution. But the relative importance or ranking of any individual pressure to the oceans really depends on where you're at, the location you're at, and what are the key drivers in that particular place. And the work we've done helps really map and see where these drivers are having a big impact, and what we might do to mitigate or restore these particular places of the oceans. So I'm sure almost everyone on this session is aware of the fact that, the two ways that we derive food from the sea are from fisheries and aquaculture. You're probably also aware that in the last 30 or 40 years, capture fisheries, wild-caught fisheries, have mostly been level. There's lots and lots of work that's studied how much we might be able to increase wild-caught fisheries sustainably. There's not a lot of room there. We're kind of at that maximum or really close to it. But over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen a steady increase in aquaculture production. And in fact, just a year or two ago is the first time in history that aquaculture production of food has exceeded wild-caught fisheries for food. So it is now the dominant source of seafood production from the oceans, although clearly wild-caught fisheries are fundamental to so many parts of the world as well. Just to really hammer home the importance of aquaculture, the production of farm fish has exceeded that of beef, which is clearly a dominant source of protein and food around the world. So if we really want to understand broader food systems, not just seafood, we really need to be paying attention to aquaculture as a key player in our global food systems and nutrition for people around the world. A few years ago, we did some work to really understand the global potential of aquaculture. And so we modeled where one could grow different types of seafood, fish and shellfish around the world, and to highlight how much potential there is. So there is, if you look at constraints to aquaculture, depth and storm activity and things like that, as well as productivity, primary productivity that fuels a lot of aquaculture, even with those constraints, you have 3% of the ocean, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a huge amount of area that is suitable for growing aquaculture. So there is massive potential to allow us to think strategically about where to place aquaculture to minimize its impact on the oceans and maximize its benefit to local farmers and local communities. And indeed, just 1% of that 3%, so a very small amount of that area, could produce almost 100 million metric tons of seafood. That's the total amount we get from wild-caught fisheries in an area about the size of Lake Michigan. If you're not from the United States, it's one of the 5 Great Lakes up near Michigan. So it's a really small area, could produce a huge amount of food. So there's massive potential from aquaculture, but we need to be thinking about it in a strategic way to make sure that we place it and develop it in a way that is beneficial to the environment and to people. And just one more comparison and thing to kind of plant the seed in our minds for discussion. We recently, last month, released a study where we looked at the cumulative environmental footprint of food. And here we compared chicken and farmed salmon. And the two key take-homes from this work is, one, they're remarkably similar. So you can see that both have a footprint in the sea and a footprint on land. We feed forage fish to chicken, and we feed soy and other crops to farm salmon. And so we have really remarkably similar footprints, environmental footprints from these two foods. And that leads to the second main point, is that for animals that we feed in our farming production, the feed is a key driver of the environmental footprint and therefore sustainability of these food products. And so when we are growing fed livestock and fed aquaculture, we have a lot of opportunity to improve the environmental sustainability through feed innovations, but also risks of too much concentration in food production and fed animals of amplifying our environmental footprint. So some stuff to think about there. So I wanted to keep my comments brief. Hopefully that gets people thinking about some of the bigger pictures, and excited for Jess to dive a little deeper into some of these issues and really think more deeply about what we're talking about. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ben. And I am delighted to say that Shakuntula has now joined us, our second speaker. So in the nick of time, hello and welcome, Shakuntula. Let me briefly introduce you, and then perhaps you could just go into your presentation. So Shakuntula Thilsted is the director of the Nutrition, Health and Food Security Impact Area platform for the CGIAR. She was awarded the 2021 World Food Prize for her groundbreaking research, critical insights, and landmark innovations in developing holistic, nutrition-sensitive approaches to aquatic food systems. She was also awarded the 2021 Arrow Global Food Innovation Award for Research Innovation. And Shakuntula is going to be talking about the nutrition and more broadly the health dimensions of aquatic products. So hello, over to you, Shakuntula.
Thank you so much, Tara, and thank you for having me. I'm now here. I thought I was on different platforms, but fine. So in the last couple of years, and I would say just starting with the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 and leading up to that, 2 years through that, there has been interest in aquatic foods, much more than there was before. And this interest continues. And as we heard from Ben, there is a lot to look forward to in transformation of food systems by including aquatic foods. And when we talk about aquatic foods, it's just not fish, it's the diversity of aquatic foods, which include animals, plants, and microorganisms. And as Ben reminded us, they are either farmed or harvested. And we must also remember that it's diverse foods, diverse aquatic foods, but it's also diverse environments. So it's both marine environments and inland water bodies. And importantly, it's also diversity of people and diversity of diets. So different peoples, different regions have different cultural preferences, different ways of preparing food, different ways of consuming food, and therefore it is all important we take into consideration this diversity in order to make best use of aquatic foods. I want to draw your attention to the UN nutrition paper, which we wrote in 2021. This was a collaboration between UN Nutrition and the FAO and WorldFish. And we launched the discussion paper on the role of aquatic foods in sustainable, healthy diets. And I would ask all of you to find it. You can find it on the internet. And it really gives, for the first time, a comprehensive overview of how diverse aquatic foods can play an important role in sustainable, healthy diets. It highlights the existing evidence and recommendations to harness and use aquatic foods to promote diets. And it is important to bear in mind that these diets must be socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable. So we have to meet a number of goals with including diverse aquatic foods in healthy, nutritious diets. We know that there are many people, many more than we think, because our database is inadequate and is insufficient. But the estimates that we have on paper tells us that more than 3.3 billion people consume aquatic foods. And we must remember, again, when we talk about aquatic foods, this is very, very diverse. I've worked, for example, in Cambodia, and at parts of the year when I've looked at fish consumption in Cambodia, which is a country that has a large consumption of aquatic foods, fish consumption is small compared to other aquatic foods. So it's extremely important that we take into consideration diversity. And we also take into consideration not only the consumption, but also take into consideration the role that aquatic foods play for livelihoods and income of many people, many times the same people who depend on this food for food and nutrition. Importantly, also, I think when we talk about nutrition and diverse aquatic foods, it's termed a protein food. And this is both incorrect and inadequate, because aquatic foods provide more than just one essential nutrient, protein. It's an extremely valuable source of micronutrients, minerals, and vitamins, and also micronutrients with high bioavailability. Not only that, when you eat aquatic foods together with other foods on the plate, aquatic foods enhances the bioavailability of micronutrients from the other plant source foods on the plate. So it's much more important in terms of nutritious diets, healthy diets, than just as a source of protein. And I will employ all of you not to use the term a protein food, but talk about diverse aquatic foods. Thank you.
Thanks, Shakuntula. So on to Jess now. Jess, over to you.
Thanks, Tara. I'm just going to share my screen. So I'm going to talk more about the social sustainability of seafood, and in particular, working conditions. So to begin, you cannot have sustainable seafood systems without safe, equitable, decent, and dignified working conditions for every worker in every supply chain. Working conditions are a fundamental dimension of sustainability's social pillar. Specific to marine capture fisheries, which is the sector that I mostly work in, The International Labor Organization of the United Nations estimates that there's approximately 128,000 fishers globally working in conditions of forced labor at any given time. It's also, the ILO also recognizes that this number is likely underestimated because, first of all, it's very difficult to access workers who are working in conditions of forced labor in general, like any illicit or illegal activity. They're often a hidden population. And in fishing, that's compounded by these workers working on a vessel out at sea, which may be a couple dozen up to a couple thousand miles from a shoreline, and thus out of sight of enforcement agencies and authorities. So when we're talking about working conditions, we're actually talking about a spectrum of practices. So on the really far egregious end, we can think like forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery. And those are mostly regulated by international conventions that have been ratified by various countries into their domestic policies. So when we hear things about debt bondage, where migrant workers may incur extreme debt, upwards of thousands of US dollars, to make a couple $100 a month. And then that debt, they might be coercive debt in that they feel like they can't leave a bad employment situation because they won't be able to pay off their debt when they return home, or that debt may be added to without their knowledge. It might be manipulated, etc. That would be an example of something on this extreme end of the spectrum, like forced labor. However, there are lots of other practices that we wouldn't call decent work. So decent work would be on the extremely good end of this spectrum. And for the past several years, we've often sort of looked at this as a binary picture, that it's either forced labor, and if it's not forced labor, it must be decent work. And that's really sort of been perpetuated by research practices, to be completely honest. And the reality is when we define decent work by the absence of its antithesis versus what's written into regulation, we actually normalize and overlook lots of really poor practices. So some of those poor practices might be in violation of labor laws and regulations, such as excessive working hours and violation of domestic working hour laws. So we often consider that labor exploitation when it's in violation of labor laws and regulations, but doesn't actually reach the really high threshold of what forced labor, modern slavery, or human trafficking might be. But we also have really poor practices that are certainly indecent work, but may not even be in violation of a labor law. For example, our last big piece of research was actually about the working conditions in the UK fishing industry, where we found extreme forms of labor exploitation, including forced labor. But in particular, on UK flagged fishing vessels, it's really common for a migrant fisher to work side by side as a deckhand with a British national who's also a deckhand. So they have the exact same job, but that migrant worker is going to make about £1,000 per month, whereas that British national is going to make roughly, the average is about £3,500 per month. And so wage disparities based on nationality may not actually be in violation of labor laws, but it's certainly indecent work. So that gives you an example of the different types of practices we're talking about. So when we talk about these poor practices, people often think that these things only occur in Southeast Asia or in Western Africa. A lot of that is a product of what we call the spotlight effect. So some investigative journalists did some work, called the attention to the problem, and then researchers, NGOs, civil society, et cetera, they all started focusing on those areas. But the reality is that by focus on these so-called hotspots, and again, I'm not saying that these working conditions don't happen there. These poor working conditions certainly happen in these geographies, but they happen most other places too. So when we focus exclusively on hotspots, we often create what I call blind spots. And this is sort of a map of cumulative research findings over about the past 10 years. And the gray countries aren't absolved, meaning that there are no labor issues in their fishing fleet. But all the countries in blue are actually countries where throughout our research for the past 10 years, we have found evidence of labor exploitation and forced labor. So you can see this is a really diffuse problem that is happening all over the world. And for those of you in the US, if you're not aware, we have lots of migrants in the Hawaiian longline fleet. And actually they're denied, they don't require immigration permission to work because we don't consider, there's a legal loophole that says that working on a US flagged vessel that is not fishing in US territorial waters is not US based work. So the Hawaiian longline fleet actually picks up its migrant workers in Mexico, and then those workers may live on board the vessel in the port in Honolulu, not ever being able to come into the actual city of Honolulu, sometimes for 2 to 3 years, making on average about $350 per month. So this is some maps from a paper that we published last year, looking at, in part, the co-occurrence of labor abuses in IUU fishing, so illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. There's often a narrative that IUU fishing and other environmental drivers like fish stocks perpetuate labor abuses. And certainly that is the case. But if you look closely at these maps, you'll actually see that there's a much greater diffusion of labor abuses than previously supposed, so in those hotspots. But there are also areas where labor abuses in IUU fishing are not associated, or that we found weren't associated. For example, there's a more geographic breadth of labor risk around Europe than IUU risk. And there are areas of low risk of labor abuses in the US, particularly around the Northeast, where we are here at Tufts in Boston, and the Gulf of the US, versus no risk of IUU fishing identified in those areas. So are you seeing a pattern here? It's basically that there's an association between port risk for IUU fishing and for labor abuses in some geographies, not others. So when we hyper-focus on the relationship between the IUU fishing and the labor abuses, we're perpetuating those blind spots, and that these issues of labor abuses are not occurring in other countries. Those are mostly high-income countries that we ignore when we're focused exclusively on this relationship between the environmental and social issues. And it can be very hard to try and regulate to ensure social, economic, and environmental sustainability. For most of the initiatives currently happening around social sustainability and seafood, there's a tendency to actually use the initiatives that were started for environmental purposes and to try and add on or bolt on a social dimension. But that's actually creating a lot of problems. Sure, there are those synergies, and you could eliminate the environmental problems, and it would go a long way to eliminating the labor abuses. But things like discrimination, wage theft, wage abuses, those things aren't visible in the same way that environmental violations can be visible by technological sources of data. Things like discrimination are not as objectively measured as some of the environmental issues, et cetera. And a great example about the risk of, great sort of bad word, but a good example in terms of the risk that happen when you try to combine the environmental and social initiatives is actually goes to this vessel called the Tunago number 61. So the Tunago number 61 is the vessel that fishes for tuna, and it was involved in a fisheries improvement project, which is sort of like a flagship corporate social responsibility initiative. Also, fish coming from this vessel was determined to being sold as MSC certified. So if you go buy fish in your supermarket and you see that blue check mark, that's an example of an MSC certified fish or piece of seafood. And again, another flagship corporate social responsibility initiative. So this vessel was fishing in an area, in a fishery, in a supply chain that was considered to be some of the best of the best. But the reality is, on February 4th, 2019, U.S. Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold and release order, which is essentially a trade ban for using forced labor. So all imports of tuna harvested by the Tunago number 61 had to be ceased, and any current imports were detained. And so what had happened was the sort of great perception of this fishery in these environmental initiatives was actually fair washing the labor issues that were actually happening on the vessel. So when we're thinking about addressing and trying to address all dimensions of sustainability sustainability in a holistic way, we also need to make sure that we're aware of potential unintended consequences, that all dimensions of sustainability are allocated appropriate funding, resources, expertise, and that we're constantly assessing for feedbacks to make sure that we are capitalizing on synergies, but also mitigating some of those trade-offs that can occur. So with that, I will stop there. So thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to everyone. So we've got our 3 panelists up now. Perhaps we can get them up sort of visible on the screen. So like that was all absolutely fascinating. And what I was hearing from Ben was sort of the big picture of the problems associated with the marine environment and potentially the role of aquaculture in well-sited conditions and presumably the right kind of aquaculture in mitigating some of those pressures. What I'm hearing from Shakuntula was the vital role that particularly micronutrients play in the nutrition, particularly of very marginalized, vulnerable peoples, people in coastal areas. And what I'm hearing from Jess is that it's just not good enough to think about things like modern slavery when you're thinking about poor working practices, that you have to think much more systemically about problems of discrimination, even within the more kind of formal, acceptable and legal range of the working practices. So there are all these sorts of priorities going on, and I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a very, very big question, but how would you start to marry the focus on getting the pressure off the oceans and focusing on the right aquatic practices, on building decent jobs and working conditions, and also on providing foods that are actually going to benefit the people who need them the most, rather than, let's say, disappearing from the country and going to perhaps northern populations in the global north who perhaps are less critically dependent on those micronutrients. Now, someone's got the answer out there, so who would like to go first?
I can start, Tara.
Thank you.
As I alluded to when I spoke before, for me, a key concept is diversity. And with the diversity of peoples, geographies, and the diversity of production systems, as Ben has talked to, the diversity of consumption, there is a lot to build on. And if I would take into consideration where we are with aquatic foods, and harnessing the power of aquatic foods, and I speak particularly in terms of nutrition, and in terms of nutrition for vulnerable population groups, including, for example, women and children in the first 1,000 days of life, then it's extremely important that we build on principles of the right to food, and we build on principles of social justice and equity. If we do not start with principles, then it's extremely difficult to get us to the position we want to be in. The second point I want to make is that for a long time, and still now, if you look at food and agriculture, the focus is on producing more, and more on the quantity, and the focus on quality in terms of nutrition quality and food safety has come after, and I would say it's just emerged on the scene. When we look at the whole food systems, and we always start with production and inputs to production, we are missing the big picture. There are times where we must start with consumption, and those who consume and move back. There are other times where we must start with supply chains and the actors in supply chains and move either backwards to consumption or forwards to consumption or backwards to production. So and holistic food systems approach gives us this opportunity to start to enter different pathways and to enter at different points. Also at policies, both national, regional, and international policies. And an important point for me as I move forward with the work I do is not just look at how much we can produce, but look at how much we can save or how much we can add to the amounts we produce by reducing loss and waste. I think this is an extremely important entry point to get us to where we want to be and to be able to make full use of all the potentials we have at different parts of the food system in a more holistic manner, and also bringing the principles I talked about from before. So it's exciting. There's so much we can do, and there's so much we can do if we are clever enough, and if we look at the entry points and the potential from very many different parts of a holistic food system. Thank you.
Thank you. Would someone like to come in? Ben, it seems like you're about to say something.
Just to build on those great points, Shakuntula, thank you. That two things related to what you said that I think are important to highlight. One, you're right, the diversity of seafood is phenomenal and wonderful and really different than most of our other food systems. Livestock and crops have over the centuries really concentrated on a very small number, where seafood has this unbelievable rich diversity of species that we harvest or farm. But especially in aquaculture, there's a push towards homogenization through the industrial scale of farm salmon, farm shrimp, tilapia. There's like some key things that are emerging as these dominant species. And that homogenization I worry about, and I think we have an opportunity now before we see in the sea what's happened on land, to come in and create incentives or policies or structures in our economies and our governance to keep that diversity there. And a lot of that comes from really supporting small scale farmers and fishers, because that's where a lot of that diversity comes from. And then the second point is sort of related. I mean, I know you both know this, but seafood is incredibly traded globally. I think it still is the most traded food commodity. And that trade is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because, what is happening in one place can get moved and shifted to another place. We can export our environmental footprint to other places. We can ignore loose governance structures and get the food without having to worry about it or so on. But it also creates an opportunity that we can use policy and governance and economic trade incentives to shift that distribution of seafood to places that are doing it more sustainably, that are avoiding slave labor or other labor problems. And so we have a policy tool at the international scale that we can leverage to try to address some of these problems. Thank you.
Jess, I'm sure you will have an answer to that, but I have a specific question in relation to Ben's point to you, which is Ben was talking about the need to support small-scale farmers and fishers. And so my question is, when you're looking at labour abuses within the fisheries sector, do you see a relationship between the size and the scale of the production of the fleet and the quality, the working conditions?
Yes and no. I mean, there's certainly risk in every sector, and we actually see lots of risk in small scale fishing. It just may look differently. One of the problems is, I talked briefly about geographic hotspots and blind spots, but we actually have hotspots and blind spots in lots of different ways. One is we tend to focus mostly on high seas fishing fleets and large commercial industrial vessels. And of course, there's no standardized definition at the international level in terms. So when we say things like small scale or industrial or commercial, we're not always even using those terms in the same way. But and similar to that, we see a lot of workers who are moving from small scale fleets into larger commercial, more industrialized fleets. And so, one of the ethos of our work is to really keep the attention on the workers, and that the workers should be at the center of everything. That is in our defining our understanding of the problems, defining our solutions, et cetera. So when we really center those workers and follow the workers, it blurs the lines between small scale and industrial even more, since we're increasingly seeing lots of movement, especially in certain geographies between fishers in those two sectors. The other thing that sort of builds off what my other colleagues here were talking about was the diversity. And from an environmental and economic point of view, absolutely that diversity makes sense. One of the things in terms of working conditions is, admittedly, our understanding is so far behind the social and the economic and the nutritional dimensions of this. And so, as I mentioned, we tend to focus, talking about hotspots and blind spots. Most of what we know is actually predicated on our understanding of the industrial tuna fleets. And we tend to hyper focus on labor issues in the tuna fleet at the expense of ignoring other commodities that are caught even by the same vessels, et cetera. But by vessels who don't fish for that at all. And why that's really important is because actually the gear type on the vessels very much relate to working and rest hours, which can also be a really strong indicator of exploitive, abusive, or even forced labor in terms of the working conditions. So for example, in the UK, we have scallop dredgers, and the cannons have to be shot every couple of hours. And so it's very labor intensive in terms of what the crew actually have to do. And then patterns of how we crew and captain those vessels tend to also further exploit migrant workers. So when we're thinking about improving the diversity of seafood that we consume, we have to play catch up, for lack of better words, in our understanding of the labor issues. And we can't just apply what we know about tuna to it, nor can we ignore those other commodities because we're so focused on tuna.
Thank you. So just trying to be a little bit more upbeat and sort of positive. Ben, you highlighted the huge potential for sustainable. I can't remember what you said. 1% of coastal areas, 94 million tons. Was that the figure?
1% of the 3% of really ideal areas. So tiny fraction of our coastal waters. Yeah.
So I would be really interested to know from all of you where you have seen good practice and what good practice looks like, both environmentally and in terms of the marrying of the environmental and the nutritional, and extending beyond aquaculture also to look at fisheries where you have seen good practice, Jess.
Do you want to go first, Jess, or?
Sure, I may have the more pessimistic answer in that I'm not certain we have a great example of what good working practices really should look like. And part of that is because we very much have marginalized the workers on the vessels, and they're the ones who should be defining what is the sort of gold star, what is the best practice, et cetera. With that said, we are in the UK, we are taking the worker-driven social responsibility model, which in terms of working conditions and labor is considered one, it's got 10 years of evidence behind it as one of the best things that you can do to actually eliminate forced labor in your supply chains, but also to ensure decent work, eliminate lots of those other exploitive norms. And so it's never been applied in fishing, but we at the moment are building a pilot of worker-driven social responsibility in UK fisheries. So again, it puts workers at the center of it. They define the code of conduct, et cetera. And so, hopefully in a year or two, we'll be sitting here saying that that's an example of a really great practice, but it should be the workers sitting here saying that, not myself as a researcher.
I'm aware that we've got very little time, and I would have loved to go into more detail, but please, Ben and Shakuntula, give me your good news.
Yeah, I'll do it quickly, and then Shakuntula, you can end with the hopefully really high note. So there's a lot of enthusiasm around seaweed and shellfish aquaculture for lots of good reasons, and it's often done small scale, which is great. It's environmentally sustainably most of the time when done at small scales. It supports local farmers and workers. It's nutritious, on and on. So I think, and then that's kind of taking off in all parts of the world in exciting ways. Just to clarify, shellfish does not include shrimp. I'm talking about oysters and clams and mussels and things like that. There are some really exciting offshore finfish operations, not salmon, although there's some really interesting innovation there too. But there's great examples of taking advantage of the environmental conditions offshore that support healthier growth of the fish. They reduce the environmental pressure, and when done at reasonable stocking densities, can be done really well. And there are some neat examples. I won't go into detail, but there are great things happening and innovation in that space that are still small scale, that when you go offshore, you're talking about more expensive infrastructure. So you really need kind of a larger corporation to help back that, but really neat stuff happening.
Thank you, Ben. That was going to be one of my solutions, looking at the low trophic species, beginning with seaweed in terms of its multiple values for nutrition, and also the role of women in seaweed production. I'll give two examples briefly, Tara. One, and both I've worked with, and the one that I've worked a lot with is the pond polyculture in Bangladesh. And we know that that small-scale polyculture of aquaculture is extremely important for the total global production of fish and other aquatic foods. And we've seen this in Asia, and if we can move these examples, these very strong examples from Asia to Africa, many parts of Africa, they will be able to benefit from diverse aquatic polyculture species, or stocked fish as well as non-stocked fish. And the other example I gave is using technologies, solar technologies, for drying of captive fisheries, especially small fish species in Africa, across the Great Lakes of Africa. If we look at consumption patterns across many countries in Africa, the largest consumption comes from dried small fish. And remember, to get it comparable, you must multiply by a factor 4 to compare with the fresh fish consumption. So it's extremely important. No one multiplies by the factor 4, so we do not even know the true value. And if we would use these solar technologies, for example, for drying, we would reduce cost in terms of women's work. We would reduce losses. And just imagine if we would have these products that are nutritious and at the same time safe, and we can use them in government programs such as school feeding programs, which everyone is calling for now. Taking into consideration the issues we are facing with meeting nutritious foods to vulnerable population groups like school children. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And sadly, we're out of time now, but I just wanted to thank you all, and to our audience, do please, if you have any further questions, do post them in the chat or post them directly onto our community platform, and Jackie will have given the address. So thanks very much, and have a good rest of the conference, and goodbye from me.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.